chapter 16, we're going to talk about the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So in this chapter, we're going to start with the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Talk about the spinal cord meninges. You know, the meninges are on the spinal cord, like dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. We'll go through the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord and the functions of those regions. Then we'll talk about some of the spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord and get into a little bit on reflexes, as well as the development of the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord, you know, it's part of your central nervous system, but it serves a vital link between your brain and the rest of your body. So if you think about how most of your communication with peripheral tissues occurs, these information has to go through the spinal cord to get there, for the most part. There are some nerves that don't go through the spinal cord and come from your brain directly, but a lot of tissues have to communicate with the brain via the spinal cord, so it serves this vital link between your brain and the rest of your body. Now, the way it serves as a vital link is that there's a lot of spinal nerves that attach to the spinal cord and then go out to attach to peripheral tissues. Now, these spinal nerves serve as a pathway for sensory and motor impulses. Remember, sensory is afferent, so it brings information to your central nervous system. Motor is efferent, so it brings information away from your central nervous system out to muscle and glands. And your spinal cord is also responsible for reflexes, which are the quickest reactions to a stimulus. You know, example reflexes like the patellar tendon reflex, where you tap that patellar tendon and your leg kicks out. And we'll talk about specifically the structure and function of how that reflex works. Now, looking at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions. And these are mostly divided by, you know, what areas of the spinal column you find the spinal cord. So for the most part, the cervical regions can be found in the cervical vertebrae. And the thoracic region will be found in the thoracic vertebrae. However, the spinal cord ends at L1. So the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal segments of the spinal cord actually emerge from different areas of the spinal column. You don't find the spinal cord in the lumbar area for the most part. You know, it ends at L1. You don't find the spinal cord in the sacral region or the coccygeal region. What you find, though, in these regions are nerves that actually come off the spinal cord, and I'll show you guys a picture of this, and it'll make more sense. So what this slide is showing is just an overview of the whole spinal cord. And what they've done here is they've cut away the spinous process from the vertebrae to show the spinal cord that's deeper. They do this by taking the lamina out, and they can actually do a laminectomy where you remove the lamina and spinous process to expose the spinal cord. In the spinal column, you can see that it's divided into cervical, thoracic, and then lumbar sacral segments. Now if you look here, the spinal cord actually ends right here around L1. So between L1 and L2, that's the end of the spinal cord, which is actually a little bit higher up on your back than you'd assume, right? You know, if you think about your ribs end at T12, right? That's your last segment of ribs is T12, because only your ribs attach to the thoracic vertebrae. Well, after T12, you have L1. So if you feel on your back where your ribs are located, you know, and think about where your last rib is, well, right by that last rib, that's pretty much where your spinal cord would end, which is much higher up on your back than you think, because the rest of this then does not have spinal cord in it. Because the spinal cord actually kind of tapers to an end or tip called conus medullaris. And we can see that right here. This is where the spinal cord ends at conus medullaris, right around L1. And beyond that, there's no spinal cord in the spinal column. Instead, what you find then are spinal nerves that continue down the spinal column.
Are they just extensions of the cord, or do they?
Yeah. Yeah, the nerves are just extensions of the spinal cord, and they just continue down the spinal column. But the actual spinal cord itself ends at L1, so which is actually fairly high up on your back. Now, for the cervical segments, we actually have 8 cervical nerves. We have 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, about 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal nerve. You might wonder, why do we have 8 cervical nerves if there's only 7 cervical vertebrae? Well, the first cervical nerve emerges between the occipital bone and C1, which is actually an extra space there, right? And then if you count all the spaces below that, then you have the space between C1 and C2, C3 and C4. That ends up being 8 cervical nerves. And beyond that, then we have 12 thoracic, which correlates with the number of thoracic vertebrae. And then we have 5 lumbar, also correlates with the number of lumbar vertebrae, and 5 sacral, which is about the number of fused sacral vertebrae. You'd find the sacrum. Now, if you look at the cross-section of the spinal cord here, what we find that is the spinal cord actually looks different all along its length. So here's a cervical segment of the spinal cord. Then we have thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. If you look here, the cervical segment is the largest segment of your spinal cord. And that makes sense because it's closest to the brain. And if the spinal cord serves as a vital link between your brain and your body, then it makes sense that the cervical region of your spinal cord would be the widest and the thickest. Now, the thoracic region of the spinal cord is actually the thinnest. And the reason being for this is that, if you think about what's in your thoracic area, there's not a whole lot that you need to control. You have thoracic muscles, like the trunk muscles, but those aren't under fine motor control. So it doesn't take a lot of nervous system control to move, trunk muscles. So you don't need a lot of nerves emerging from the thoracic region to control those muscles. So the spinal cord is actually thinner in the thoracic region, but then it gets larger again in the lumbar region, because in the lumbar region, that's what actually gives rise to the lumbar sacral nerves that supply your lower limbs. So it even gets larger back again by the lumbar region because it's actually going to be have lots of neurons and axons that are involved controlling your lower appendages. And then it also gets thin in the sacral region, where it actually kind of tapers to a point. So the way the spinal cord actually ends is it just kind of gets smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually just kind of tapers into nothing, right? It just tapers into some tissue. And the very tip of the spinal cord is called conus medullaris. It kind of just tapers to a cone. And then right off that little cone, we have something called phylum terminale, which I'll show you guys here in a little bit. Now, the gray matter of the spinal cord is deeper, right, which is here. And then what's gray matter made of? Unmyelinated axons and neuron cell bodies. Now, what mostly gives it its gray appearance is the neuron cell bodies. So you have a large collection of neuron cell bodies in the gray matter here. And then what's white matter? Myelinated axons, exactly. Now it's a central nervous system, so these axons will be myelinated by oligodendrocytes. Now each of these little segments of gray matter have names, and they actually have neurons that have specific functions, but we'll talk about that. In the very center of the spinal cord has your central canal, which is a cerebrospinal fluid-filled space. That's a continuation of the fourth ventricle all the way from your brain. So you even find CSF in the center of the spinal cord, in that central canal. Now, in terms of the gross anatomy of your spinal cord, you guys, we have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. And so why do we have 8 cervical nerves instead of 7?
Because there's one that's in space between your occipital bone.
You're right. The first one emerges between C1 and the occipital bone. So you have an extra nerve there, right? In terms of the number of cervical vertebrae. So that's why we have 8 cervical spinal nerves. Other than that, though, the number of nerves correlates with the number of vertebrae. So you have 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. Now, the cervical and thoracic nerves are the ones that, in part, can control your upper limbs. Not all of your thoracic and not all of your cervical, but we'll talk about that. And the lumbar sacral nerves are the ones that control your lower limbs. We'll see this. Now, if you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, what we see here, you guys, is basically a thoracic vertebrae. You can tell it's thoracic because we have the transverse processes that have our costal facets for rib attachment. And this is the spinous process, which is the posterior side of the thoracic vertebrae. And then we have the body, which is the anterior side. So here we have posterior, anterior. And if you look here, inside of the vertebral foramen, what we have then is the spinal cord. And remember, if you guys remember, the vertebral foramen was pretty thin. Like you can stick a finger through it, and your finger would occupy most of that vertebral foramen, right? But if you look here, the spinal cord is even smaller than that vertebral foramen. Like the spinal cord doesn't occupy the entire space. In fact, a lot of what occupies the space of the vertebral foramen is actually adipose or fat. In fact, what we find here, you guys, is that between the meninges that surround your spinal cord and the bone, we find an adipose-filled space or fat-filled space, which is called the epidural space. Remember, the epidural space around the brain was a potential space between the periosteal layer of dura and bone. Around the spinal cord, between the periosteal layer of dura and bone, the epidural space is not a potential space. Rather, it is an adipose-filled space around the spinal cord. What do you guys think is the function of this? Maybe some nourishment because adipose is nearby. Good. Yeah, protection. Yeah, exactly. Because adipose serves as a nice cushion. So it protects against physical trauma, potential like temperature changes because it insulates. And so it has a nice protective barrier there. So if you guys heard of people getting like an epidural, an epidural is basically we have an injection into this space. You can inject anesthetic into the space. Remember, anesthetics can cross the blood-brain barrier. They can cross the meninges very well, so they can go into the spinal cord and then help to anesthetize or paralyze those nerve fibers. Now we can see the spinal meninges here. So like the brain meninges, they're continuous, and we have the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. So the dura mater is on the very outside here, right? Then we have the arachnoid mater that's deeper. Deep to the arachnoid mater, we have a subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And then deep to that, we got the pia mater, which is right along the outside of the spinal cord itself. Now, the spinal cord, we have white matter and gray matter. And the gray matter is made of basically cell bodies. White matter is just big old tracts of myelinated axons. Coming off the spinal cord, we have little nerve roots that emerge, and these nerve roots are basically bundles of axons that either go into or out of the spinal cord. And these nerve roots can converge right here at what we call the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is what exits the vertebral foramen through the intervertebral foramen. If y'all remember, the intervertebral foramen was between the vertebrae, and it's the holes that are transverse or along the sides of the vertebrae. So these spinal nerves then emerge out of the spinal column, and then they go on to connect to other peripheral tissues, you know, whether it's muscle, skin, fascia, joints, glands. These spinal nerves are highly branched, and they connect to other tissues of your body. But this is the connection point between your body and your spinal cord, are these spinal nerves. Now, if we look at the spinal cord kind of on its own, we still find our meninges there. So we have a dura mater, our arachnoid mater, and then pia mater, which is right on the spinal cord itself. We have our subdural space, which is between the dura and arachnoid. We have our subarachnoid space, which is between the arachnoid and pia. And what we find then, you guys, is that the spinal cord has a lot of blood vessels on the outside, which makes sense to nourish the spinal cord because it's made of living cells, so it needs its own nourishment. We find the gray matter is deeper here, and that it's actually divided into what we call horns. So we can see that back here is the posterior horn. Over here is the ventral horn. We can tell this is posterior because, for one, the posterior horns are actually kind of a little bit more sharp and they're less blunted. The ventral horns or anterior horns are more rounded and larger. Okay, and two, we can tell this is the posterior part of the spinal cord because we can see that this is the posterior root ganglia or dorsal root ganglia. So if this is on the same side back here, then we know this is posterior. So this is the posterior horn. And our posterior horns they only have the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Okay, so our posterior horns house sensory neurons. The ventral horns house motor neurons. So if it's a sensory neuron, that means it's picking up sensory information. And we talked about how there's different types of sensory information. You know, we had somatic sensory and special sensory or visceral sensory. Now, in the spinal cord, this is going to pick up information about somatic sensory and visceral sensory. So information from your skin, your muscle, and joints is somatic sensory. If it's visceral sensory, what type of information is that picking up from? From your internal organs, your guts, right? Think about like pressure or stretch within your internal organs. That's picked up by somatic sensory neurons, which are also housed in the dorsal root here, or dorsal horn, sorry. Now, in the ventral horn here, this has motor neurons, and we have two types of motor neurons, right? We had somatic motor and autonomic motor. What did somatic motor neurons control? Skeletal muscle, and then how about autonomic motor? Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Good. Now, autonomic motor neurons are found in the lateral horns of the spinal cord, which you only find in mostly the thoracic segments and a little bit of lumbar too. But we don't really see that here, you guys. There aren't really lateral horns shown here.
Would that be cervical?
So this could be somewhere else. It could be like cervical. It could be it could be part of the lumbar or sacral. But it doesn't appear to be thoracic because we don't see lateral horns here. Now, the white matter, bless you, around the spinal cord is called the funiculi. So we have our dorsal funiculus, our ventral funiculus, and our lateral funiculus. And all these funiculi carry tracts, and a tract is basically a big old bundle of axons. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the functions of these white matter tracts because each white matter tract carries a different type of information. Like it might carry sensory information from joints, or it might carry motor information just to appendage muscles, or it might just carry motor information to trunk muscles, and they're carried in their own specific tracts that we'll talk about later. Now, what you'll find that is associated with the spinal cord, we also have our little roots or rootlets. Now back here is the dorsal root, and up over here is the ventral root. Because the dorsal root's associated with the dorsal part of the spinal cord, what type of information do you guys think this would carry? Sensory, you got it. Because remember, the dorsal horns have sensory neurons, which means their associated root will carry sensory axons, right? And then our ventral root carries motor axons, which are associated with the ventral horn, which has motor neurons. And then these roots combine to form the nerve. And this nerve, the spinal nerve, carries mixed sensory and motor information. So if someone damages their spinal nerve, then you can see that they might have deficiencies or problems with both sensory and motor function. But if someone damages their posterior root, then you're going to see only loss of sensory or only loss of motor if it's the anterior root or ventral root. That makes sense. So looking at this in a little bit more detail, you guys, we see our horns, right? So what horn's this? Ventral horn. We can tell because it's not on the same side as the dorsal root ganglia. You find the dorsal root ganglia over here. We see this is the posterior horn. Which of these horns carries motor neurons? Ventral horn, right? Which one carries sensory neurons? Posterior horn or dorsal horn. And then we can see our little lateral horn right here, you guys. This little nub off the side is lateral horn. It also has motor neurons, but a specific type of motor neurons. It has autonomic motor, which is for smooth muscle and glands. And you can see that right here off to the side, that little lateral horn there. What about this little space in the center? That's the central canal, right? What do you find in the central canal? Yeah, cerebrospinal fluid. And how did that CSF get there? Yeah, it came from the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle has choroid plexus, which makes CSF. In fact, this little hole right here, you guys, the central canal, it's the remnant of what's called the neural tube. The neural tube gives rise to your entire nervous system, like your central nervous system. It all starts out as a tube of cells. Well, if you have a tube, then there's a fluid-filled center, right? Well, it turns out that even as adults, that fluid-filled center remains from when we developed our nervous system, from when we were a fetus. We also have our gray commissure, which is right here in the spinal cord, and our white matter nearby. So we have our dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, and ventral funiculus, or anterior funiculus. We have our dorsal root and ventral roots, and then the spinal nerve. Which one carries only sensory? Spinal nerve, dorsal root, ventral root? Dorsal root. Which one only carries motor? Ventral root, right? Which one carries both? Spinal nerve, exactly. In fact, your spinal nerves and the nerves that emerge beyond those carry both information, motor and sensory. So if someone has peripheral nerve injury, it's going to affect motor and sensory for the most part. Okay? So most nerves in your body carry mixed information, sensory and motor. However, we learned about how the cranial nerves, some carry only sensory, some carry motor, some carry both. What this slide shows again, you guys, are the functions of those little parts of the spinal cord. So over here we see our sensory neurons, and they're going to receive information from the periphery, whether it's somatic sensory or visceral sensory. And then we find over here our motor neurons, like our somatic motor and autonomic motor. What does autonomic motor control again? Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And you only find autonomic motor neurons in the spinal cord in which area? Lateral horn, which you only find in the thoracic region. You got it. And then we can find somatic motor neurons, though, all along the spinal cord, in the ventral horn or anterior horn. And the somatic motor neurons control what type of muscle? Skeletal muscle. And is skeletal muscle voluntary or involuntary? It's voluntary, right? So you can see that here. So here's in red is somatic motor, in kind of yellowish orange is autonomic motor, which you both find in the ventral and lateral horns. Now, for the dorsal horn back here, we can divide the neurons you find in the dorsal horn by whether they carry somatic or visceral sensory information. So what type of information is somatic sensory? Yeah. Think of information from skin, pressure, touch, temperature, vibration. So skin sensations, as well as joint position and stretch of muscles and fascia. That's somatic sensory. That's body sensation. Like if you feel your body, that's somatic sensory. You can see that the somatic sensory neurons are a little bit more superficial here on the dorsal horn. Whereas the visceral sensory neurons are deeper in the dorsal horn. And then what is visceral sensory information? Your guts, your internal organs. You got it. So like think of things like blood pressure, stretch of your stomach, pain from your internal organs. That type of information from internal organs is visceral sensory. And it makes sense why it's deeper in the spinal cord because it's more well protected. If you get spinal cord injury, it's much less likely you're going to have injury to visceral sensory because it's deeper in the spinal cord. You're more likely to see injury to like somatic sensory first or somatic motor first, whereas more vital functions like autonomic motor, which is for smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, that keeps you alive, or visceral sensory, which is also deeper in the spinal cord, that's involved with sensations from your guts. So these are more protected because they're deeper in the spinal cord. And you can see how the arrangement of those neurons exists here. So what we find in Meninges for the white matter of the spinal cord, we find the posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculi. And these axons are